Hey folks, welcome to the first episode of the 21st Century Blues podcast. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Tim, and today I'm joined by T. Martin Bennett. He's the author of the book Wounded Tiger, the transformational true story of the Japanese pilot who led the Pearl Harbor attack. It was just made available in audiobook in December. And today, in this episode, Martin is going to tell us more about the book, Wounded Tiger, its core messages, and how we can apply the core lessons learned from Wounded Tiger to live better lives, more connected lives in the 21st century world. Martin, thanks so much for taking the time for this. I'm very, very excited to get into this with you. Before we start talking about the book, can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, of course. Tim, thanks so much for having me on your program. Well, my background is I went to college 3 years, dropped out because I didn't feel like I fit anywhere in college, and it's not uncommon for people who are very creative to do that. I ended up volunteering at a nonprofit for a number of years, and then later, my wife and I started a company making dog collars in a back bedroom. And people said, Martin, you can't compete with these big companies. You're nothing. And there's 100 companies making dog collars. What could you possibly do that would be better or different that will give you a foot in the market? And we thought, well, we had some creative ideas. So fast forward, we had 100 employees. We were in thousands of stores across the country in the US and Canada, Japan, the UK. We won the Small Business Administration National Entrepreneur of the Year Award. And so we figured it out. So I didn't know I was an entrepreneur until I tried it. And then, I could see those things. I love stories. I've always been drawn to true stories from an early age. I wrote a screenplay on the life of John Newton, who wrote the song Amazing Grace. He was in the transatlantic slave trade. His life story is absolutely mind-boggling. So I understood how to write a screenplay. I studied it in depth on my own, many books, and I met with filmmakers at the very highest level. So then I stumbled across this story of the guy whose name is Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the attack on Pearl Harbor. And I never heard anything about his story before. And to learn that after the war, he regretted his participation and, worked for peace and his kids became US citizens, I thought, okay, I need to find out what this story is all about. And the more I dug into it, Tim, the better it got. And that is the story of Wounded Tiger.
Man, it's definitely an intriguing story, and I'm wondering, how did you feel like when you were learning all this, when you're writing all this, especially, given how significant the Pearl Harbor attack was for the history of the US, it would probably set you off on a real roller coaster of emotions.
Yeah, so I mean, I love history. I love true stories. I love biographies. And as a kid and in high school and grade school, we all know the Pearl Harbor attack. It was a huge, transitional day for the United States history. And I knew that it happened, but I didn't know why the Japanese attacked the U.S. And I didn't understand what their goals were. And when I asked teachers, nobody really knew. All they knew was they're the bad guys, we're the good guys. We won, they lost, the end. And I thought, well, I need a little bit more information than that. So when I came across this story about Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, handpicked by Admiral Yamamoto, I thought, okay, what is this story? I never heard it before. And the more I got into it, the better it got. This is an unbelievable story. And I've had people tell me they thought they were Pacific War buffs, but once they read Wounded Tiger, they realized there was so much on the Japanese side they never heard before. And it made for a very compelling, interesting story. Even though it's a 600-page book with over 300 photos, maps, and images, I've had multiple people tell me they read the entire book in a single sitting. So it does drive forward. But for you to know, Tim, it's not just about the pilot who led the attack and what happened in his life to turn him around. It's also, he's about 50% of the story. Then about 30% is a guy named Jake DeShazer, an
Mhm.
American who volunteered for the U.S. Army Air Corps, which was the precursor to the Air Force. And he volunteered for a mission he knew nothing about, which was the Doolittle Raid, which was the first counterattack against the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. That took place in April 1942. Unfortunately for him, his plane ran out of fuel. Their crew bailed out, and he was captured by the Japanese, who were not too happy with him. He and his uh, other captives were tortured, in solitary confinement, horrible conditions, food. Some died, some executed. I mean, it was just hell on earth for him. And his story and how he deals with that and how his life ultimately impacts Fuchida is another key part of the story. And the third piece, Tim, is the third plot line is the Covell family, who are teachers and highly educated teachers and missionaries who went to Japan. Their kids were born in Japan. They loved Japan. They loved the Japanese people. They went to the poorest of the poor in the burned out sections of town, and they would help people. I mean, literally every week they would go and help people. But when Japan ramped up for war, they fled to the Philippines, and the parents said sent their children back to the United States. And the daughter ends up having, that is the Covell daughter, Peggy Covell, ends up having a phenomenal impact on the life of Mitsuo Fuchida. I'm not going to give that away, but these three stories begin completely independent of each other, and then slowly they work towards each other in a way that's completely unpredictable, but really positive. It has a really positive, happy ending, and I think we can all learn from this story. And I think that's why you're doing the interview. We want to learn from history and how to be better people.
So what would you say are kind of the core messages of this story? What are the key lessons that we can learn from it?
Well, I begin the book with a verse from the Bible, from Malachi, that says, "Are we not all children of the same Father? Are we not all brothers?" And I like the verse because it's a question. It's not a statement. It's not a judgment. It's a question. Are we brothers or are we not all brothers? Well, when we see the enemy as different than ourselves, then we tend to, characterize them in a cartoon, evil way that makes it easy to hate them. They're different than us. They're worse than us. They're not like us. And so in, World War II and in all wars, you see the different armies and the different forces ridiculing the enemy, mocking them and making fun of them. And the Americans did that to the Japanese, said they were monkeys in the jungle. And the Japanese said that about the Americans. They just love baseball and jazz, and they're just selfish people. Europe's at war. They don't care. They're not helping anybody. They're just selfish. So what happens in the story, and to answer your question, de Shazer, on one hand, was forced to be in prison. He hated it, but once he started realizing that they're just human beings like me, I'm just like them, he realized that they had more in common than they had not in common. And he went through his own changes of moving from hatred to love. And what was the fulcrum of that was he remembered his mother, who was a good person, and she, said grace at the table, but she was a sincere person who didn't trust in herself. She trusted in God, and she loved people because of that. So when Jake DeShazer was in prison, in his own words, crazy with hatred toward the Japanese. I mean, he was seething with anger toward the Japanese, both for his incarceration and for his treatment and how his buddies were being treated and how one of his best friends died. He just said he just wanted to kill the Japanese people. But when he saw that his mom loved people, he thought, well, I need to figure out how this love thing works. And witnessing that journey is really, really interesting because he was super skeptical, was not a believer. He didn't know what he believed. So that's the second part of the story. But that establishes in the story, for your knowledge, Tim, that we are more alike than we are different. And if we see other people as part of the same family of human beings, we treat them differently. If you consider everyone part of your family, you're not going to treat them the same way as you say, well, they're just other than me, they're different than me, they're terrible people, we're just going to kill them all. And I know it sounds like an exaggeration, but during World War II, there was a common sentiment among Americans: just kill all the Japanese, wipe the island clean, and start over because they're so evil.
Man. Okay, I was just gonna say how beautiful what you were saying was, but obviously that last part was far from beautiful. But exactly to your point, right? It highlights how important this focus on love is, how important it is to go from love towards hatred. And actually, I checked out in one of the audiobook clips that I checked out, it was Jake learning about the attack and him getting totally angry, totally frustrated. And even at that point, his mother is like kind of, trying to calm him down. And he's just not having any of it at that time, right? He's just so keen on, basically
Yeah,
what
he
you
was
were
keen
just
on
saying.
revenge.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Revenge. And so one of the things this book addresses, not directly, but in actions, is how did the cycles of revenge ever end? in this world, you see it today. Revenge just goes on and on and on. Well, they did this to us, we'll do this to them, and then they do something back to you, and it just goes on and on. So, how does that cycle of revenge end? Somebody somewhere has to say, I forgive you. I'm not taking revenge anymore. And that's what happened in this story. Now, with with the Mitsuo Fuchida, it was a very different story than Jake DeShazer's. He was not necessarily driven by revenge. He was driven by selfish ambition and national ambition. He saw what he perceived as the great countries of the world, Great Britain, Germany, the US, colonizing other nations. So he felt, well, they're doing that. Japan should do the same thing. So Japan then, colonized Korea. They went into northern China and Manchukuo. They took that over, and they just felt like, well, this is what great powers do. They colonize, they take over other people's lands. It's been going on since the history of the dawn of civilization. That's what people do. But he wanted to be a part of a great nation, a great conquering nation, and a nation that would be respected by the world by their conquest. That's what he believed. Well, things went great for Japan for Pearl Harbor as far as they were concerned. He was a superstar in Japan. It went better than anyone ever imagined. They expected losing up to like 150 planes in this attack, 180 planes. They lost 29. And it was a phenomenal success. But then later in the Battle of Midway, which was only about 6 months later, they lost four aircraft carriers, which they could not replace as fast as the Americans could rebuild. So they thought, Fuchida and the others thought, that's the end. Japan is not going to win this war. We're done. But they still fought because they were too proud to surrender. It was not part of Japanese culture to surrender.
So would you say that Fuchida underwent a similar transformation to Jake, or
Yeah,
was
he
it?
did. Yes. And so what happened with him, and again, I don't want to give things away, but his transformation happened when he read about Jake DeShazer's story, and he respected him because he was a daring pilot. The raid they did was very daring and very successful. It was not intended to kill people or damage property. It was intended to demoralize the Japanese and to make the government and the military realize that the U.S. can attack downtown Tokyo whenever they feel like it. You can't stop us. Now, at the time, the Americans were engaged in the European, battles and that theater, and they were sending all their supplies there, but they were preparing to attack Japan. But what happened in in Fuchida's story is that he found out about Jake DeShazer, and he read his story, and he wondered, why would you love your enemies? Then he came across the story of Peggy Covell, who was sent to upstate New York, and she heard that her parents were being mistreated by the Japanese, and that really hurt her personally. But she was also someone who tried to believe and trust God and love her neighbor. And, God says to treat others the way you want to be treated. So she tried to find a way where she could extend love toward the Japanese people instead of hatred, like many people were doing. So she volunteered to go to an internment camp in Colorado where there were Japanese Americans incarcerated, separated from the West Coast, which was called the exclusionary zone. And so the US government moved all the Japanese away because they didn't know which Japanese were loyal to the US and which Japanese might be loyal to Japan and be part of sabotaging, the utilities and water supply and spying on movements and sending the information to Japan. So I'm not saying I liked it or I endorse it. It was a difficult decision, and there was really no good path where everything is going to be great. Anyway, she went to these internment camps and volunteered to help the Japanese Americans, and she spoke fluent Japanese. And later she volunteered to work in a hospital where there was POWs, prisoners of war, in a military hospital, and they had a Japanese ward. And since she was Red Cross qualified and spoke fluent Japanese, it made sense for her to volunteer there. It was very rare for Americans to speak Japanese at the time. So she treated all these men with love and kindness and grace, and they were just so honored to have her treat them so well. And they tried to find out, why are you treating us so well? And she talked about what had happened to her parents and the persecution, etc. And they were horrified because in Japan and in most cultures, you don't love your enemies, you destroy your enemies. So this man was Fuchida's engineer on his planes, and he goes back to Japan after the war, and he tells Fuchida about this girl who loved her enemies. And Fuchida was just confounded by that. Why would you love your enemies? I don't understand that. We kill our enemies. Why would you love your enemies? So all these things are part of the gears of what, was going on in his heart and his mind, his spirit about, a change of life. Let me put it that way. So when the war ended, Japan was destroyed. Millions were dead. He was a villain, So President Roosevelt called December 7th a day that will live in infamy, and he was the man who led that day that will live in infamy. So Fuchida was just depressed and felt like he was a complete failure. I mean, 1,000 times worse than anybody thinks. Like, I screwed up, I cut the grass wrong, I spilled a glass of milk. Well, he's got millions of dead people at his feet. Like, what have you done with your life? You have destroyed your nation. And many leaders, military leaders, especially in Japan after the war, they just committed suicide. That was an honorable way to essentially punish yourself
Wow.
for your failure as opposed to surrendering to your enemy. So he was at a very, very, very low ebb, and he started writing a book on no more wars, no more Hiroshimas. And he didn't know what to do. So when he came across the story of Jake DeShazer, who went from hating people to loving people, and then he came across the story of Peggy Cobell, who went way out of her way to love her enemies, he thought, okay, where does this love come from? And that was a great question to ask, because when you seek things, you tend to find them.
Man, that's so mind-blowing. It's so beautiful. Basically, loving your enemies. In a world with so much going on, with so much contention, with so much division, with so much hatred, basically, it seems so counterintuitive, but it should be the most intuitive thing of everything, basically.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily difficult to understand, but it's difficult to do. So
Mm.
Jake DeShazer was treated horribly in prison. I mean, he was sick. He had open sores on his body. I mean, one of his guys just dropped dead of exposure, and he knew his life was just hanging by a thread. But what he did is he knew that his mom believed in God. And so he wanted to get a Bible and find out what this is all about. So they passed books around. He finally got this Bible and he read it voraciously, but extremely skeptically. I mean, he was like, well, does God talk to people in a voice? What is with that?
Mm.
And how does God know the future? How could that even be possible? I don't know. So he had a lot of questions, many more questions than answers. But finally he said, well, I don't want to live a life of hatred. I'm just going to try this out. I'm going to try to just love my enemies and see what happens. And so when he steps out and starts to love this guard, things start to change. Things start to happen. Amazing things start to happen. And even supernatural things start to happen. He thought, okay, I'm going to go on this journey. And I think for me and for readers of the story, you think, well, this is interesting. Let's see how he gets there. Because Wounded Tiger, the book about these stories, is not an instruction manual. It is a demonstration of journeys of transformation and how it happens in real life and in real time. And it's not a clean, how can I say, a package with a ribbon on top. It's messy, it's confusing, but it's surprising in a really positive way.
That was really, really well put, and I'm really excited about the movie. Is it coming out soon? I know that the trailer is out yet already.
Well, yeah. So what happened with Wounded Tiger was that I wrote the screenplay first, and I got it in front of investors, and everybody, I mean, almost all of them that I've shown it to said, "Oh, this is going to be really successful. We love this. We want to buy the rights." That's called an option. Well, if I sell the rights to the story, they can do whatever they want. They can add material, delete material. They can put in a clown juggling balls. I mean, I can't stop them to do anything. So I'm not a micromanager, I'm not a control freak, but I wanted to be able to protect the integrity of the story because the star of every movie is the story. And if the story gets damaged, the movie doesn't work anymore. So I declined those offers, and I've gotten four offers to, excuse me, fully fund this $125 million film. So what happened was I took the story and I novelized it to book form and released it on Amazon, and that's where you can find it. And it's the reverse of how it's usually done, Tim. Usually you have a movie based on a book, but in my case, it's a book that's based on a movie. So it's actually
Mm.
I took the story and novelized it. So it's extremely accurate. I just want you and your listeners to know this is not a bunch of creative license where I put a bunch of stuff in the story to make it good. This story is phenomenal without anybody adding anything to this story. So I spent literally years on research and getting this story right. So then I took the screenplay, novelized to book form, and that's available now. And it's gotten, I mean, tremendous reviews. But as far as the movie's concerned, uh, um, a producer, the producer of Hacksaw Ridge, reached out to me. Are you familiar with this film, Tim?
Hacksaw Ridge. No, I don't think so.
That's all right. It's a true story on it has to do with the Battle of Okinawa and a man who saved the lives of 70 people, although he was a conscientious objector. He did not believe in killing people because of his religious beliefs. That's not me, but that was him. And he ended up saving people's lives. The movie was nominated for Best Picture of the Year, did really well in the box office. So the producer of that film called me on the phone and asked what's going on with Wounded Tiger. And I explained what I just shared with you, that I turned down these offers. He said, well, Martin, you have the book, get the book out there. When investors find out about the story, that's when they'll come to you and they'll bring money to the table. So if the money's on my side of the table, then I can partner with any major studio, who wants to do it and still retain creative control. So I have met with the president of Warner Brothers in his office at his invitation, where we discussed a co-production deal, and I asked him directly. I said, if we did a co-production deal, would you do that deal if I retain creative control? He said, well, yeah, we would do the deal, but you have to bring money to the table. I mean, it comes down to funding. You gotta have to have money and you have to control that money. So if I just sold it to a studio, I'll have no control. They just do whatever they want. It might be good. It might be awful. So for me, one, I want to retain creative control. And also, if I just do an option, I get pennies on the dollar. I make almost nothing compared to the people who are producing the film. So right now, I do have a number of investors who have full funding to do this film. They're looking at the material, and I'm hopeful that we'll get a deal done and put the thing into development, but it'll still take 2 to 3 years before it'll be released. But I think it'll be broadly appealing. It's a really positive story. And even though there are spiritual elements to the story, I've had people who are complete atheists, or one guy was the head of an atheist club, and he told me, he said, Martin, this is really an amazing, encouraging story. So I think there's something that everybody can get from this story. And just as a final note to this part of the conversation, on the back cover of the book, I have the words, remember the past, live for the future. So I think that's why we love history, is because it's entertaining, it's engaging, but we can also take something from that and apply it to our lives that'll make things better for our own futures.
That's actually exactly what I wanted to talk a little bit more about. We're recording this in December of 2024. Obviously, a lot of stuff going on in different parts of the world, a lot of basically different wars going on that it's getting harder and harder not to be at least somewhat involved in and not to have some kind of opinion on. So it definitely seems like Wounded Tiger and the stories that you shared in that book can really help us out a lot, and now is a really good time to kind of be conscious of these lessons and to start applying them as much as possible in our daily lives.
Yeah, we can all learn something from history. And that quote of remember the past, live for the future was given to me from a Japanese national I met in Japan. And Wounded Tiger has been translated into Japanese and released in Japan on Amazon. And he read the book, and we sat and had dinner together, and then we corresponded. He was actually born in Hiroshima. And he said that, these are terrible things that have happened, but we have to learn from the past and remember it, but we have to live for the future because that's what we can change. We can't change the past. And I thought that was really well said. And so I used that on the book, and that's why we enjoy history.
Mhm. And yeah, so I think we're recording this actually just a few days before the audiobook is released. So,
Well, the
so
audiobook is ready to be uploaded to Amazon, but the problem is Amazon, I didn't realize this, Audible has like a 1 to 3 week approval process on audiobooks. So it'll be available at some point in December of 2024, but you just have to check the website and look up Wounded Tiger. It's already available as a hardcover book and as a Kindle ebook. But the audiobook is pending their approval. It could get approved in 1 week. It could get approved in 3 weeks, but it will be done. And to be honest, I'm not an audiobook guy because my mind wanders too much. I'm a creative person, and I have to keep rewinding it to remember what I just listened to because I got lost in some other thought. I have listened to multiple audiobooks though, but what I did is we took this book and gave it to people who are audiophiles who listen to hundreds and hundreds of audiobooks. And a friend who listened to the sample that I think you heard as well, he said, Martin, this is absolutely fantastic. This is exactly what we want. So what we did is, since there's three plot lines in this story, that of Fuchida, Japanese national, that of Jake DeShazer, an American who bombed Japan, and that of the Covell family, the primary characters being the father and the daughter, we used three separate voices.
Mhm.
And for Fuchida, it was very difficult finding a Japanese national who spoke fluent Japanese, who could speak with an authentic accent, but not so thick that you can't understand what they're saying, but not so light that there's just nothing there. And we found this guy who's absolutely fantastic, and I'm highly impressed with him. And I'm not highly impressed with very many people. I'm certainly not impressed with myself. I'm pretty hard on people. So this guy really does a great job. And then the guy for Jake DeShazer, he does a phenomenal job. And then for the Covell story, we have a young female that it could be Peggy Covell's voice, who was in her 20s when she really had this gigantic impact on the life of Fuchida. And she does all the parts of the Covell story. So these three voices in the audiobook really came out tremendously. And people can hear a sample on Amazon. Once the book is uploaded, you can hear the sample passages and then you can decide for yourself.
Yeah, the voice actor for Fuchida definitely absolutely nailed it. And I think that this won't be live too early, and that definitely, the audiobook will be available by then. But if not, then we'll update the episode description and stuff
Yeah.
with all the info. And before we kind of start winding down the conversation, I'm interested maybe in a little bit more big picture stuff, and just because we're talking about the current situation in the world as well, do you have any main hopes or expectations for how everything unfolds next year in 2025?
Yeah. So I remember reading an article about a doctor who worked with very obese patients who wanted to lose weight. And he said that for these people, there was always some incident that happened that triggered something that says, I have to lose weight. And maybe it's a group photo and they see everybody and they see themselves like, wow, I didn't realize I was that fat. Or maybe a guy at work who everybody liked and was happy and seemed healthy and he just drops dead and like, okay, I've got to do something different here. So what happens in this story of Wounded Tiger, when people read it, it's a catalyst for change. When you see other people change, you realize, okay, I can be a different person. And a really great example was somebody I was referred to, a Japanese American who was an attorney, very intelligent. They said, Martin, you need to have this woman review your book. She can give you book reviews. She can help you make connections in the town, in the city we're in. So I went to her house with a copy of the book, a pre-release version. She asked a bunch of questions and she was very skeptical. And she said, is Emperor Hirohito a character in the story? I said, yeah, he actually is a character in the story. He's actually quite important and he interfaces, throughout the story. And then she said, you're saying this is a true story. Man, how true is this? I said, it's very true. And she said, people say it's a true story, but they just make stuff up. And I said, well, I really worked hard to keep this accurate, and it is accurate. She finally said, Martin, I'm not going to like this book at all. It's not for me. And you don't want me to read, write a bad review. So I'm going to read like 10 pages and I'm out. But this is not for me. I said, fine. So obviously, you know why I'm telling you this story. About 2, 3 days later, I get an email, Martin, unbelievable story, absolutely fantastic. I will help you. Let's go, blah, 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 this and that. And I told her when I met her, I said, if you read the book, I'll take you and your husband to dinner. We can just hang out and have fun. So, of course, I took them to a Japanese restaurant. That's appropriate. I have says samurai on my hat. I know you're just
Mm.
audio on the show, but I have samurai on my hat because I try to, get into Japanese culture however I can. So we're at this restaurant. I have no agenda. We're just hanging out, talking, having fun. But toward the end, this woman, whose name is Carolyn, she leans forward, she takes her glasses off, and tears start coming down her face. She says, Martin, I got to share something with you. When I read this story, I saw how people loved each other and how they loved their enemies. And she said, I've always hated my mother because the way she treated me. When I was a child, she locked me in the basement. We'd scream and cry and pound on the door. She was just mean. She said, even to this day, I hate my mother for how she treated me, and she still treats me badly. She said, but when I saw what people did in this story, I realized I must be a better person. And I thought, that's the starting point. That's what everyone needs. We all need that. I mean, I don't know about you, but every day I strive to be a better person than I was yesterday.
Yes, Yes, exactly.
every single day. And it's a very, very slow growth thing. So it's like oak trees are very strong, hard wood, but they grow very slowly. I remember having willow trees in my front yard and they grew just so fast. The neighbors were like, wow, those trees have just grown so fast. And they were so impressed with these willow trees. Then we had a windstorm and branches were falling out of these trees, and one tree fell over completely. And I remember when it fell over, the roots were just like nothing. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go for slow growth in my life. One small changes over a long period of time can transform your life. And so when people read Wounded Tiger, I've had many people say, Martin, I felt I needed to read it a second time. I've been thinking about this for the last 3 days. I just keep thinking about what happened in the story. So for that reason, Wounded Tiger is a catalyst for change. And this is a small giveaway, but after the war, Fuchida gave a speech, and it was impromptu, and it was in the newspapers. And he said in his own words that he knew that war had to change, war had to end, but he thought, where does war come from? It doesn't come from governments, it doesn't come from machines and bombs, it comes from the heart. So if war comes from the heart, then peace must begin in the heart. That's where peace must begin. And I thought, that's a great observation from a man who's been in war. And that's something we can all take away from. So it's not a matter of passing more laws and more government. That doesn't change people's lives. You can't legislate peace. You can't legislate love. That's something that a person has to choose to do within themselves. And of course, in the story of Wounded Tiger, you'll see that the best way for a person to begin to forgive others and love others is to be forgiven themselves and to understand they are loved by God themselves. Once you understand that and that river of life starts pouring into you, then that river of life can start pouring out of you. And you can watch all this happen in real time in the life of Fuchida, in the life of DeShazer, and of course in the Covell family. They love their enemies, and it's really a horrible, terrible story with a really happy, positive ending.
Well, Martin, this was actually the perfect note to finish this conversation on. I have nothing to add. Just before we wrap things up and say our goodbyes, the book you said is available on Amazon. You can also go for listeners. You can also go to woundedtiger.com to learn more. Are there any other ways to connect with you or learn more about you
No,
and
that's
what your
that's
plans
pretty
are?
much it. But if you go to woundedtiger.com, there's you can read the first chapters free there. There's a book trailer there. There's more information about the project and myself, and you can sign up to be updated on progress on the book and the film, which I've been working on this for a long time. And this person I spoke to said, Martin, we've got $100 million free and clear. We can do this. Let me read it and find out, and I'll get back to you. So I don't think we're that far away from the project going into development.
Man, I'm certainly looking forward to it. Looking forward to sharing the word, spreading the word through this podcast as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with you. It's been a fantastic conversation. I love learning more about you and about the book.
Tim, thank you so much. It's great being with you. I'd love to do it again with you sometime.
Okay, I'll take you on your word for that. We'll be in touch. And yeah, to our listeners, that's all for today. Take care, everyone.